Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your thoughts slow down. You're about to drift into a quiet corner of history, one that rarely gets told with softness or patience. In this slow retelling, we explore what it truly meant to be a woman in the Middle Ages, not in battles or ballads, but in the early hours of cold mornings, the quiet work of hands, and the quiet endurance of an ordinary life. It's sometime around the year 1320 in a small English village not far from York. The sun has not yet risen, but life stirs within a timber-framed cottage with a thatched roof and no chimney, just a hole in the ceiling to let out the smoke. Inside, a woman perhaps named Alice or Joan, as those were common names of the time, awakens before her husband and children. Her body aches from yesterday's labor, and she knows today will offer no rest. She stokes the fire, if there are coals left, and begins the first of many tasks before the light even touches the fields outside. If this storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. In the Middle Ages, women's lives were largely shaped by the rhythms of survival. Most women were peasant laborers. Though some belonged to noble families or became nuns, the vast majority lived lives tied closely to the land. They didn't own much, and their lives were often measured in seasons: sowing, harvesting, preserving, enduring winter, and praying spring would come again. A woman's morning might include grinding grain with a heavy hand mill, known as a quernstone. This task alone could take hours and was often done before sunrise. She would then bake bread, fetch water from the well, feed livestock, and tend the garden. This wasn't considered work in the way we think of employment today. It was simply life, and it was expected. Marriage was not necessarily romantic. For many, it was practical, arranged by families, determined by land, money, or status. Girls might be betrothed by age 12 and married shortly after. Upon marriage, her identity legally transferred from her father's control to her husband's, and once married, she could not own property independently in most cases. And yet, within this system, women carved out spaces of strength. They kept homes running. They managed food storage, healing with herbs, and midwifery. Their knowledge was passed not in books, but in hands-on experience, often unrecorded by historians. That's part of why these stories seem so quiet, but they mattered. They held communities together. Even the clothing she wore told a story. Rough woolen gowns, sometimes dyed with onion skins or berries if time allowed, and a linen headdress or veil to cover her hair, considered a symbol of modesty and control. But was she truly seen? As she labored and served from dawn until dusk, did anyone really see the weight she carried, not just in buckets of water, but in the expectations of a world where her worth was often invisible? Outside the village, the roads were little more than muddy tracks, winding between fields and forests. The church bells were the day's only clock. For women, especially those of lower status, time was not measured in hours, but in chores completed before the next began. There was no separation between work and life. It was all one continuous effort to keep things from falling apart. By mid-morning, our imagined villager, let's still call her Alice, might be walking to the communal oven with her dough. Firewood was precious, so most households didn't bake their own bread. Instead, they paid a small fee to use the village oven, owned by the local lord. Nearly every aspect of her existence, even the baking of bread, was tethered to someone else's permission. And yet, it was done with practiced hands, passed down from mother to daughter. Not far from her path, a lord's manor might rise above the village, its stone walls cold and unwelcoming. Noble women, too, had restrictions, though of a different kind. They managed large households, oversaw servants, embroidered religious tapestries, and arranged alliances through marriage. Their wealth brought comfort, but not necessarily freedom. Their lives were shaped by duty, piety, and reputation. And unlike peasant women, their failures were often more visible, gossiped about, judged, and sometimes punished with exile from court or the withdrawal of family support. If this slow walk through history helps you find peace, gently press like and subscribe only if your heart feels at ease. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments, along with the time where you are. Back in the village, Alice would have spent much of her life pregnant. Women in the Middle Ages bore, on average, 5 to 7 children, though many died in infancy. Childbirth was dangerous. There were no antiseptics, no trained doctors, only midwives, often other women from the village who had attended births for years. If a woman died in childbirth, her husband might remarry quickly, not out of coldness, but survival. Life demanded it. And when she wasn't pregnant, she might be caring for her children, tending to aging parents, or helping with field work. In harvest season, women worked beside men. They gathered grain, sorted vegetables, threshed and winnowed. Their labor was essential, yet rarely acknowledged in records. Official history favored kings and crusades. It rarely paused to consider the quiet endurance of a woman lifting hay under a gray October sky. There was also the church. Religion saturated every corner of life, and women were both revered and controlled through it. The Virgin Mary was upheld as the ideal, pure, gentle, obedient, while Eve was remembered as the source of temptation and sin. This duality shaped expectations. Women were expected to serve and to submit. Education for them was rare, unless they joined a convent. Even then, literacy was limited, and knowledge was often filtered through male clergy. But what happened when women stepped beyond those expectations? What if a woman spoke too boldly, refused marriage, or learned to read without permission? Could she survive a world that was built to silence her voice? Let the air grow still, and listen closely, not to trumpets or sermons, but to the soft warnings passed between women behind wooden doors, in gardens, and by candlelight. For women who dared to think differently in the Middle Ages, the world did not simply watch it judged. And often it is punished. By now, Alice, the woman we've been following through her quiet day, has finished feeding the goats and patching a torn sleeve. Her hands are never idle. But not every hour is filled with labor. Sometimes there is talk. And talk, in medieval villages, was both dangerous and necessary. It's late afternoon. Perhaps a neighbor stops by to borrow salt or offer news. Rumors might pass between them of a woman in a nearby town who read strange texts, or of someone whose herbs healed a sick child too quickly. In a time when most women couldn't read, and medicine was more superstition than science, knowledge in the hands of a woman was seen as suspicious. The line between healer and heretic was thin. Midwives who understood herbs and anatomy might be respected one season and accused the next. The church warned against women who knew too much. Men wrote books of theology, law, and medicine, and any knowledge outside their words became dangerous. If a woman healed someone when a priest's prayers failed, she might be labeled unnatural. If you're still with this gentle unfolding of the past, consider subscribing quietly. You can always share where you're listening from. Your time zone becomes part of the story too. The truth is, fear traveled faster than facts. A woman might be accused not for doing harm, but for being unmarried too long, or for crying too loudly at a funeral, or for simply not smiling enough at market. Villages were small, memories were long, and judgment often fell hardest on women with no one to defend them. Marriage offered some protection, but also limits. A married woman was expected to obey her husband in all things. The law supported this. If a man beat his wife, it was rarely punished unless it endangered her life. The law codes often defined women through relationships, daughter, wife, widow, but almost never as individuals. Yet, widows sometimes gained surprising power. Without a husband, a widow could own land, manage property, and even sue in court. But that freedom came only after loss, and often in old age. Not all stories were grim. There were women who ran businesses, especially in cities. In places like Florence or Paris, Widows often took over their husbands' trades, bakers, brewers, weavers. And in convents, some women found space to read, write, and think. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, wrote music, science, and theology. But such women were rare. Their names survived only because they were exceptions. And still, through centuries of obscurity, millions of unnamed women survived without praise or punishment, just silence. They endured, whispered, worked, and waited. Some rebelled in small ways, a hidden book, a delayed marriage, a secret healing. Others simply continued, unnoticed. But in a world that watched them so closely. It's night now in our medieval village. The fires are low, the children are asleep, and Alice, like countless women of her time, sits beside the hearth, darning yet another piece of worn linen. Her world is small, bounded by fields and faith, routine and silence. But history isn't only made by queens or martyrs. Sometimes it shifts when one woman chooses to act differently, quietly, carefully, but deliberately. Across Europe, there were women who tested the invisible limits set around them. Some challenged them boldly, most didn't. Instead, they worked in shadows, bending rules instead of breaking them. Take, for example, Margery Kempe of 14th century England. A merchant's wife and mother of 14, she wasn't royalty or a nun. Yet she dictated what is now considered the first autobiography in the English language. Her visions, pilgrimages, and outspokenness earned her suspicion, but she walked the line carefully avoiding formal accusations of heresy. Others resisted more subtly. A village girl might delay marriage by claiming illness. A woman might use Latin phrases she overheard to impress or frighten those around her. A healer could pretend her remedies came from divine inspiration, not from knowledge passed down by older women. These weren't open rebellions, they were survival tactics in a system that gave them little room to breathe. If you're still listening, maybe your lights are low and you're settling in. If this gentle dive into the quiet struggles of the past soothes your mind, you might leave a like or a small comment with where you're listening from. It helps build this quiet community, one thoughtful night at a time. Of course, not every act of defiance ended in survival. Inquisitions were real, and witchcraft accusations grew more frequent in the late Middle Ages. Sometimes these accusations came not from church officials, but from neighbors fueled by jealousy, grief, or fear. A woman who lived alone, who had no children, who argued too often or owned too much land, might be singled out. The punishments varied: fines, imprisonment, exile. In some regions and later centuries, executions. But this wasn't always the norm. Most women lived their lives under the radar. The greatest rebellion, perhaps, was simply persistence, bearing children, burying husbands, rebuilding homes, and passing on the whispered knowledge that helped them survive. In towns, especially those connected by trade, women began forming informal guilds. They weren't always allowed into the formal systems dominated by men, but in workshops and homes, they trained daughters, nieces, and apprentices. A lacemaker in Flanders, a brewer in Norwich, a midwife in Cologne. They all passed their skills down through generations. They left no monuments, only craft. Even religion, a powerful tool of control, sometimes offered sanctuary. In nunneries, women copied manuscripts, studied scripture, and in rare cases, even wrote. Though their words were often filtered or edited by men, some traces remain. Letters, music, herbal texts, the edges of history. So now, as Alice puts out the last candle and lies down beside her sleeping children, the question lingers. Were these quiet acts of resistance enough to shape the future, or were they simply survival in disguise? Dawn again. The sky glows faintly as smoke rises from kitchen fires. Alice wakes, just as she did the morning before, with the ache in her back and the list of duties waiting in her mind. Her world hasn't changed, and yet, something lingers, something passed on. The medieval woman left little behind in her own name. No statues, no libraries, no laws carved with her words. but her presence shaped every part of the world she lived in. Fields plowed, bread baked, wounds tended, children born and buried. And beneath it all, a thread of quiet endurance ran through centuries, stitching survival into the fabric of history. Women weren't only victims of their time. They were organizers, caretakers, whisperers, listeners. In homes and convents, in fields and markets, they kept memory alive through songs, recipes, prayers, and rituals. They remembered births, cures, floods, famines, and feuds. They told stories, not the grand tales of kings and wars, but the stories that held communities together. Even language owes much to them. Nursery rhymes, herbal remedies, and kitchen sayings, these oral traditions, often begun and repeated by women, survived longer than the names of the lords who ruled over them. I hope this quiet walk through forgotten lives has left something with you. You don't have to say much, just a simple "still here" in the comments is enough. It reminds us that some things don't need to shout to be remembered. So what then was the true weight of being a woman in the Middle Ages? It was knowing that your choices were limited, but still finding ways to protect, to teach, to shape. It was enduring a world that saw you as lesser, but quietly building one inside it where others could grow. It was not being remembered, but never truly being gone. Because every time a woman raised her child to question cruelty, every time she passed down knowledge in secret, every time she simply chose to live one more day with dignity, she chipped away at a wall that history had built around her. Alice never knew she was part of a legacy. She only knew the rhythm of her days. But in the endless chain of mothers, daughters, healers, and listeners, she helped carry forward something the world tried to bury: quiet power. And that legacy, though not carved in stone, has reached us, in your life, in your breath, in your listening. Thank you for walking slowly through history with me. If this helped you sleep, feel less alone, or simply gave your thoughts a softer place to rest, you're welcome back anytime. Until next time, rest well. And remember, even silence leaves a trace.